The Innkeeper by Life Sketcher. Chapter 1611, Imminent Demise. Lex was not unaware of what was happening in the castle. Even if he ventured into the jungle, and left the castle in Luther's capable hands, it was no excuse for letting down his guard. He'd made that mistake before, and wouldn't do it again. Just as he left a spiritual mark on Fenrir and the others, he had left a mark on the castle and many of the workers there as well. When the armies of Abaddon appeared, he was the first one to inform Luther that they were unlikely to target them. Instead, they were gathering to face the jungle. Similarly, despite the many inherent dangers of the jungle, Lex sensed that the jungle did not actively reject him, and even treated him as a part of it. He did not know why this was so, most likely because he had a soul, and was not filled with the ever-present hunger that belonged to all creatures of Abaddon. Either way, the jungle would most likely end up being a refuge for them if they entered. Lex had suggested shutting down the castle and rushing to the jungle, for it would be quicker. Luther, instead, opted to take the castle as is, for without the protection of the castle, the mere aura of the army gathering would immediately cripple the instaff who were not yet immortals. As someone who was personally there, he had a better understanding of the situation than Lex, so Lex deferred to him. Thus the reaving dread mercenaries and those from the inn rode the castle like a chariot, pulled by two armies. This was not an exaggeration, for as soon as the castle was pulled out, the Midnight Battalion and many others immediately used their powers to craft earthen wheels below the chunk of land that the castle was attached to. Fortunately, even as the castle drove away, no one paid attention to them or targeted them. The issue itself came from the fact that soon, they could crash into the trees. "Do not stop," Cayman suddenly yelled, unsure of whether whoever was controlling the two Hellion armies could hear him. "The condottiere has become aware of our situation and has offered help. All we need to do is make sure we take back a sapling from within the forest for him." No one felt a change, nor did they know if anything happened at all. Yet as the armies approached the jungle, the trees moved out of the way, allowing them to venture into its depths. Yet the commotion seemed to attract the attention of the insects that filled the forest, the insects that seemed entirely unaware, or unbothered, by the invading army gathering at their doorsteps. Instead, they attacked the targets that came right to them. The castle came under siege, and so did the armies pulling the castle itself. This was a critical moment, for they needed to get in as deep as the jungle as possible. They didn't even know if entering the jungle was safe to begin with. All they knew was that this was their only hope. "Fight back!" Leonidas roared. "Keep them off the walls and protect the two armies." As the battle to protect the castle began abruptly, there was no time to build up the music. Z picked up his baton and immediately dove to the crescendo, shocking and eliminating many insects. The others didn't hold back either. Sunny lit the sky on fire, making it rain fiery hail on the numerous insects. The mercenaries used their long-range weapons to target distant insects, distracting them even if they were not defeated. Tavern workers served cold drinks and sandwiches to replenish spiritual energy and alleviate mental fatigue as well as hunger. For a time, they managed to hold off the insects at bay. Yet the commotion caused was too great, and the castle too large and prominent. Eventually, even though the Hellion armies were not vanquished, and the defenders kept fighting, the chains attached to the patch of land were broken, ending the castle's journey. If they wanted to go deeper, they would first have to fight off the armies, and that was easier said than done. That's because soon, the stronger insects scuttled over. Hundreds of heaven immortals, and dozens of celestial immortals, filling them with dread. "The condottiere says we don't need to fight them off," said Cayman, wearing a grave expression. "We only need to survive until the battle outside begins." "It's tough to say whether we can survive for even a few minutes," said one of the mercenaries, looking at the incoming army of insects. "If it were just Earth immortals, even if their numbers were many, they would have been able to do something. Or maybe if it were only a few heaven immortals, there was still a chance. But in front of so many powerful enemies." Even Lex nearly tried to teleport back. It wasn't that he had a weapon that he could certainly use, but rather if anyone had a chance to do something, it would be him. Whatever they did, they could not rely on using the innkeeper's business card, for that might attract the attention of Tao beings, and that would most certainly spell their doom. Each and every moment was critical, and everyone was thinking of the best possible solution, when someone entered the great hall. "Excuse me, do you mind if I try something?" asked the musician fairy, the one that had been playing the flute earlier. "What do you have in mind?" Luther asked, showing none of the anxiety that such a situation called for. "Well, it's not much. I just thought about what the innkeeper would do in this situation, and had an idea. So if we..." The fairy told Luther his idea, and though it was bizarre, completely insane and entirely unlikely to work, Luther nodded. "Go ahead." He raised his hand and created a massive projection of the fairy above the castle walls, looking out at the jungle filled with insects. All eyes fell on him, and for a moment the fairy had stage fright. Yet his belief in what the innkeeper would do was strong, so he forced himself to act. He connected the flute to his lips and played a short and quick jingle, before setting it aside. "Welcome, residents of the abandoned jungle, to the Midnight Tavern. We provide food, we provide drinks, but more than anything else, we provide a good time to all our guests." Silence. Deafening silence filled the air after the fairy spoke, and not even a cricket chirped. Chapter 16:12, So Full of Blood. The invading army of insects paused, as they looked at the floating fairy up in the air. The reaving dread mercenaries looked up at the projection oddly. Just a moment ago, they were killing insects left and right. What were the chances that the other insects would just forget about that and come to enjoy a tavern? As it turned out, the chances were very good. "I say, a tavern in the jungle?" "Really?" said a massive wasp in the purest British accent ever spoken. "I could do with a good drink. All the jungle has to offer is diluted honey and insect guts. Not the most refined of tastes." "Speak for yourself, Harriet Reginald III," spoke a massive dung beetle, similarly in a posh, British accent. "I find the jungle to have an excellent selection of food. I could use a good scrub though. Not many bathing options in these accursed lands." A celestial level mantis approached the castle walls faster than any of them could process, and looked down at Leonidas curiously. "For a thing so full of blood, it's amazing you don't slosh around when you walk," it said, looking at him. "How do you do that? Is it some kind of law?" "My dear Concord Barrett Kilimanjaro 4, it's obviously because of all that skin." "I mean just look at it," said a celestial level caterpillar as it crawled up, similarly at a very fast pace. "That's a lot of skin for one creature, but the humans really make it work. Good for them." Though the insect tried to be polite, anyone who heard its tone could tell that it really was just being polite. "Make it work? I don't think so. 3 breathing holes? That's just showing off," said another insect as it crawled up, revealing a terrifying body with only a single hole out which to breathe. "A human? Is that what this is called?" asked a centipede as it gently poked C's cheek. "The exoskeleton is on the inside." Such a bold choice, and yet somehow it's not dead. How incredible. "If you think that's incredible, hear this," said Concord Barrett Kilimanjaro 4. "They digest the food after eating it. Truly marvelous creatures." "How do they not fall over with just 2 legs?" asked a millipede. "They don't," said Harriet Reginald 3. "They have an inbuilt cushion for whenever they fall. I believe the cushions are called buttocks." The dung beetle seemed incredibly pleased with itself for its advanced biological knowledge. As more and more insects gathered, and began discussing the peculiarity of humans amongst themselves, the fairy just stayed there awkwardly, unsure of what to say. Although it had thought of copying the innkeeper, it wasn't like it had the incredible charisma of the innkeeper. Now that everyone was looking at it, it felt socially awkward. That's why it preferred playing the flute to talking. Fortunately, while the fairy was frozen in awkwardness, Z was already used to being in situations he didn't want to be in. Ignoring his cheeks being pinched, he immediately spoke to the insects. "Please, guests, join us. Come inside the tavern and let us provide you with refreshments. Within the tavern, the moment they entered, their aura no longer intimidated anyone, which allowed the many staff members of the tavern to effortlessly act as gracious hosts. As trained workers of the inn, they were more than familiar with the taste preferences of insectoid guests, so there were no awkward encounters where they served them the wrong thing. Instead, a harmonious environment suddenly filled the tavern as countless insects lined up to enter through the gates, because that was the polite thing to do. Unlike the tavern workers, the mercenaries were unable to adapt as quickly, and were stuck there with gaping faces, observing as the enemies that were threatening to kill them just moments ago washed their hundreds of limbs with lavender soap and cleaned themselves with scented warm towels. An ant entered the bar and upon seeing the fireplace exclaimed in shock. "Open flame indoors? Bold. We'd never dare that back in the colonies." "Quite mad. Very human." "You don't know the least of it," said Viscount Spindle. "They voluntarily gather around this inferno. Look at them, just sitting there, as if combustion weren't actively occurring. Splendid grit. A very keep calm and smolder on attitude, isn't it? If you think that's mad, look at this mural," spoke a firefly, also known as Professor Glow. He pointed to a painting of a fight between a human and a dragon. "They just attack dragons. No offering? No ritual? Honestly, the whole lot of them are so confident. Walking sacks of meat, swinging swords at myth. Peak optimism right there. My word. How incredibly audacious. I bet that human doesn't even need to perform a mating ritual to find a mate," said a cricket jokingly. Of course the humans would still need to perform a mating ritual. How could one mate without the ritual? It was right in the name. "Oh cricket, you're inebriated," said a male ladybug as he stifled his laughter, talking to the cricket called Cricket, named after the sport, not the species. "How could you even think of such a thing? Without the mating ritual." Cayman, who was ready to sacrifice a lot of his vitality to activate a hidden weapon given to him by the condottiere to fight off the insects, put the weapon away and gulped. A part of him could not believe what was happening, but as he walked through the halls filled with drunk insects, joking and chatting like they were at a party, he asked himself a very important question. Why in the world am I the only one without a drink? Bartender. Give me a drink. Lex, who was honestly ready for the absolute worst, breathed a sigh of relief. That was a close call, not that they were out of the woods just yet. For one, they were in a jungle, not the woods, they both had different kinds of vegetation, not to mention canopy structure, and secondly, though more importantly, there was still a massive army waiting outside. Chapter 1613, Hungry Jungle. At the very edge of the veil of where reality broke off, Lex studied the castle for a while longer. He innately felt that once he attempted to cross the veil, he would no longer be able to afford any distractions, so he had to set his mind at ease before leaving. The first thing he noticed was that only the celestial immortal insects had names, and spoke amongst themselves. All others, even heaven immortal ones, all remained silent, and seemed to be mimicking their stronger counterparts more than anything else. The second thing he noticed was these insects seemed to have a pretty elaborate, and probably sizable community. In spite of their varying actual races, they treated each other as one, and interacted as if they were quite used to each other's presence. Lex had no idea how large this jungle really was, but imagining that it was large enough to host an entire society where celestial immortals were akin to common citizens was scary thought. While he was observing this situation, he heard Z ask the one question he had been wondering for a while. Sir Harriet Reginald III, Z called out the dung beetle. If you don't mind me asking, why is everyone so nonchalant about the army gathering on the border of the jungle? One of the reasons we escaped into the jungle with the tavern was because of the army. Army? What army? That's just fertilizer. It delivers itself to the forest after every soul feast, right on schedule. It wouldn't be so bad if we got to fight them every now and again. But the forest is just as hungry as them, so it eats them all up. There's nothing left for us to do. Z accepted the answer, as if it were perfectly logical, and did not mention it again, at least to the dung beetle. He went around and asked a number of the insects while serving them, but no matter who he asked, that was the answer he got. For once, Lex and Z were equally bewildered. The army outside contained Tao beings, they were sure of it. Yet such beings were entirely unable to defeat the jungle, let alone its residents. That was spine-chilling information to hear, but at least the jungle treated them as one of its own, and didn't act against them. That was nice. At the same time, it was incredibly bone-chilling. What kind of entity had they encountered? What was this place? Why was it here? Based on Lex's understanding, in the modern universe, the death of a Tao Lord was considered a rare thing, and verged on nearly impossible. Only in the true heaven, or whatever land that the universe made up, would their deaths become easier. Yet now he was supposed to believe that every time there was a soul feast in Abaddon, a number of Tao beings lined up outside the forest to feed it? Of course, he could tell that feeding it was just a joke. In truth, they fought, and were defeated. Yet defeated and killed were not the same thing. More importantly, where were so many Tao Lords coming from? How could Abaddon afford such expenditure of Tao beings if they died after every feast? Lex received a new appreciation for how incredibly terrifying Abaddon was, and couldn't help but ponder on some of the things he'd learned or speculated on about this place. He theorized that Abaddon itself was a parasite to their universe. If that was true, then it was clearly on a level of power he could not understand. He wondered if Abaddon could be considered alive, or if it was just some kind of parasitic version of a realm. In their universe, realms, major, minor and all other sorts, gave birth to regular life that contained souls. If that was the case, and Abaddon was a special kind of realm from outside the universe, then it made sense that the type of life it would create would be different. Since a major realm could give birth to Tao Lords, as a parasitic realm, Abaddon might also be able to give birth to Tao Lords? But how could it make them so frequently? Could it mass-produce them? That didn't make sense, right? All of this was merely speculation on Lex's part, and wasn't necessarily true, so he stopped thinking about it. He couldn't ignore the fact that this place also hid a lot of potential secrets, such as secrets about the Forgotten Age, not that Lex really believed such a thing actually existed. The point was, they were extremely out of their depths here in Abaddon, and Lex began to feel like it would be in their best interests to get out of here as quickly as possible. He didn't know how or why the Reaving Dread had survived here for 7 years, but he had a feeling that, with his luck, surviving even one would be a challenge. After all, there had been no shortage of new or unusual things happening since the moment he came here. Assured, at least as assured as he could be given the circumstances, Lex turned his attention towards the veil. He was now wondering what entity took Fenrir and Little Blue. Chances were that it was far from simple. Yet Lex was not one who would leave anyone behind. He grit his teeth and took a step forward, towards the veil. He didn't know what to expect, so he bolstered his defenses as much as he could. Domination was, of course, on full blast. He strengthened his skin as much as possible, used his tenet to wrap his body in some laws, wore his strongest suit, and even activated Heaven's Furnace, his self-created strongest defensive technique. The exact moment he touched the veil, his body ceased to exist, leaving behind a peaceful and quiet jungle, as if nobody had ever been there to begin with. From atop a tree branch nearby, a figure that had been watching the veil narrowed its eyes. "See you later, mate." Chapter 1614, Rack and Multi. Lex was not dead, though through no effort of his own. It was just that, within this specific zone that divided the inner and outer jungle, the fundamental laws of the universe did not function. Even though Lex was an Earth immortal, an all-round badass, his existence still depended on the functioning of laws, the deeper, more esoteric laws that he could not yet sense, nor influence through his tenet. As such, the moment he entered that barrier, his body, which was dependent on those laws to exist, stopped existing. Yet he lived. That was because the nature of the soul was such it, on an absolutely fundamental level, did not rely on those specific laws to exist. That put Lex in a state of existence that was in an unusual limbo. Instead of entering his soul state, which is how he would have entered the barrier if he had known about how it functioned, Lex was in a state of being and not being. He was without a body, and therefore without a soul since his two were merged, and yet his soul continued to exist though not in any state he understood. Lex was in one very specific location at any given point in time, and that point could be anywhere at all throughout the entirety of the barrier. If Lex hadn't accepted that the universe was a lot more abstract than he previously thought, and that things did not necessarily have to function according to what he used to think was basic logic, then the state of his existence would have caused his mind to break. As it was, he had developed a certain mental resilience, which meant that his mind was only slowly crumbling apart instead of breaking abruptly and entirely. The problem was, he couldn't do anything, nor could he think. Or maybe, he had all his thoughts happening all the time. He wasn't sure. There was not a single ability that Lex had, nor a single experience he had previously gone through which could help him in his current predicament. Just as he had felt, right before crossing the veil that indicated the beginning of this barrier, he was dealing with something far outside the scope of his power and understanding. That didn't mean there was no solution. Without a single thought, or maybe through the processing of millions of thoughts, Lex innately felt that one of the fundamental purposes of this barrier was to keep out anyone or anything without a soul. As long as he had a soul, he had the basic requirement to pass through it. He just needed to figure out how. While in this state, he was not aware of Jack, nor was he aware of his system, or anyone inside the inn. He was only aware of whatever was inside the barrier. It was akin to a universe on its own, and a surprisingly stable one at that. It seemed that in the absence of those fundamental rules that dictated how the universe worked and existed, the universe would still continue to exist, but in an entirely different way. Lex closed his eyes. No, he didn't have eyes. Yet through the intention of closing his eyes, he isolated whatever senses he had, sensing as little of this universe as possible. He felt that, right now, his mind wasn't strong enough to accept this way of existence. If he began to get used to it, then once he returned to the outer universe, the one where the laws worked, he would forever be unable to adapt. He would develop mental problems, and feel like he was in a universe where he didn't belong. Then, at some point, Lex realized that he had done something. He shut off his senses through his intentions, which meant his other intentions might have an effect as well. So, naturally, he built up the intention to leave this place, yet that did nothing. He summoned in himself the intention to retreat. Nothing happened. One by one, he cycled through his intentions, always staying true to himself, never being deceitful in his intentions. It was kind of funny. His existence in the outside universe depended on him lying and bluffing, yet he never felt like he was being deceitful, which is why he could stay honest even here. Finally, after cycling through many intentions, when he finally summoned the intention of going to go save his friends, a change occurred. "What the hell are you doing, Rack?" a young, annoyed voice asked. "We have no bodies." "What happened to our bodies?" "I have school on Monday." "Don't worry, Multi," responded an older, hoarse, and slightly drunk voice. "This isn't the first time I've been a disembodied voice. I can fix this." "How are you going to do that, huh?" "Through science, bitch," Rack answered enthusiastically. "Hey wait, Rack. There's someone else here as well. Did you accidentally teleport someone else here?" "Rack. Don't think about it. Let's just go back." "I don't know about this, Rack, we can't just leave someone here. Look, he just wants to save his friends." "Rack, why aren't you saying anything?" "Okay, fine. Sheesh. Just blame me for being a good guy, always saving the day. I swear, can't go a single day without saving someone's ass." Lex felt something. It was nausea. The next thing he knew, he was on his knees, vomiting, barely holding himself up. It had been a while since Lex felt this weak. Yet the odd thing was that he also felt incredibly strong, stronger than he had ever been. He could physically feel his karma adjusting itself. His karma, which was in a huge imbalance, was swiftly correcting itself. Lex had a feeling that something had happened. He had done something, but he couldn't remember. Fragments of memories from his time within the barrier kept coming up, yet each time they came, Lex vomited them out as if they were physical things. The crazy part was, the vomiting actually worked. He was slowly losing all his memories of what had happened within the barrier, and it was fortunate too. Just the memory of how it felt to exist in the absence of those fundamental laws. Lex shuddered, and then collapsed, completely spent. At least he had the presence of mind to fall to the side, instead of in his own vomit. In front of him, the VAN stood silently, as if judging him. Chapter 16:15, Too Much Treasure. The flow of time within Abaddon had changed. Prior to entering the jungle, the time in Abaddon for the Midnight Group and the mercenaries was always flowing faster than the Midnight Realm, and not by a small margin. Yet the moment they entered the jungle, the flow of time seemed to synchronize with the Midnight Realm, and sometimes even flowed slower. For the group, this was not necessarily a good thing. While Lex was unconscious, he was truly and genuinely knocked out. His awareness of the inn had also diminished, and thus his role as the sage could no longer be acted out either. Yet Lex had planned for that as well. Since he'd already encountered a situation where he was disconnected from the inn, he'd planned out for his absence already. In fact, this only served to make the sage even more mysterious. Anyone who visited the White Room in the temple now would no longer be able to access the foggy meeting room in the dark by sitting in the chair. Instead, they would merely see a plaque with the same information that Lex had given Hargreaves. If they chose to accept the oath, so be it. Otherwise, they would lose their access to the event, meaning, they'd be kicked out of Obsidian. Lex couldn't really enforce any actual punishment to anyone, which is why the only consequence was being kicked out of Obsidian. He made the oath one of two requisites for participating in the event, which is why anyone who broke it would no longer be able to participate. The first requisite was, naturally, an invitation for him. The inn, too, naturally operated without problems. The actual issue was that the end of the Midnight Games was mere days away, with the end of the final battle within sight. Yet Lex showed no signs of waking. Hours passed, and then turned into days, and he did not as much as move a single muscle. Outside, within the jungle, over 1,000 celestial-level insects were partying at the tavern. Naturally, such wanton celebration caused the tower to crack and break. It was not built to withstand such excessive use. To the immense dread of the Reaving Dread, whenever that would happen, Luther would show up and scold the celestial-level guests. A mere earth immortal scolding celestial immortals. Did he have a death wish? Did he want to die too quickly? Was he afraid that his life was too long? Apparently not, because just as soon as Luther would come over, threatening to blacklist them from the tavern, Z would also rush over to smoothen things out. As a result, those celestial insects would pay a small fine as compensation. The fine? It was only to shed a piece of their shell, and have builder ants underneath them use them to fix up the castle. Builder ants, especially those at the Heaven Immortal realm, were masters of crafting using high-quality materials. Though insect skin was not nearly as valuable as dragon scale, being skin shed from a celestial immortal, their quality had increased drastically, making the castle stronger. Outside the jungle, the size of the army had grown considerably, and they finally began their charge. All, except for a particular black knight, rushed towards the jungle. Oddly enough, the jungle also began growing past its borders, racing to meet the army. When the two met, there was no epic clash. The army seamlessly entered the jungle and then disappeared. A tremor passed throughout the jungle, and countless tiny fruits began to grow on the trees across the jungle. Each one of them radiated an aura of power, and even a hint of Tao, driving most of the insects within the jungle insane with greed. Yet the insects did not pounce on them just yet. They had to wait for the fruits to mature first. Within the castle, all insects below the celestial realm suddenly left, as if they were called by something infinitely more attractive than mimicking their superiors. The celestial insects, however, stayed where they were, and watched with amusement. The whole jungle was suddenly filled with an air of excitement which would continue to build until the entire army outside entered the jungle. As this happened, within the inner layer of the jungle, a thin mist began to form, filled with a particular aura. Lex, who had up until now not shown any signs of moving, suddenly opened his eyes. Something incredibly strong within Lex had stirred. It was the recognition for valuable treasure. As the owner of a dragon's heart, Lex also had a hint of a dragon's instincts. One of the things that made dragons so powerful was that they could derive actual, tangible strength from the value of their treasure hoard. Although Lex had only inherited a few things from dragons, such as the strength of their bodies and their dragon aura, and he did not inherit things such as gaining strength from his hoard, he did get their sensitivity towards treasure. But the moment he opened his eyes, Lex was also hit with a mind-bending migraine. The reason he was unconscious was because it was a protective instinct of his body to protect his mind until he healed. By waking up prematurely, Lex had to deal with the consequences of his mind having been partially unraveled. "Bloody hell," he exclaimed as he struggled to pick himself up. Though the pain threatened to nearly overwhelm his mind, he didn't have time to think about that. The midnight games were mere hours away from ending. Much more important than that, though, was that right now Lex felt like he was swimming in treasure. The very air here was more valuable than even in the Midnight Realm, filled with a quality of energy he had literally never felt before. What's more, Lex could feel the surrounding mist seeping into every fiber of the jungle all around him, turning them into treasures. Some herbs, sprouting out of the ground, even gave off a mild aura of Tao. While others might think that was a good thing, in truth, it was one of the worst things that could have happened to him. The amber chaos resin aside, Lex could not come anywhere near close to anything that gave off even the slightest hint of Tao. He needed to get away. More importantly, he needed to immediately seal his cultivation. The mist that was enriching the jungle was also seeping into Lex's body, and he could feel that he was mere moments away from triggering a major tribulation. Now was not the time to enter the heaven immortal realm. Unfortunately, he might not have a say in the matter. Chapter 16:16, Desperation. A bout of nausea hit Lex, and he doubled over, vomiting one more time, before he once again continued his run. He was feeling weak and strong at the same time, and as if that dichotomy was not enough, he was also feeling extremely excited and incredibly regretful at the same time. All around him were treasures. Some of them even radiated auras of vitality so strong that he was certain eating any of them would go a long way towards healing the many injuries he had accumulated, if he didn't heal entirely altogether. Simultaneously, flowers, herbs and natural treasures were sprouting from the ground, and if even one of the ones carrying a trace of Tao aura touched him, he was a goner. The amber chaos resin was an exception. Despite being a Tao-level ingredient, it had an exceptionally soft and docile nature, allowing even mortals to fuse with it. As if that was not enough to tantalize his faint heart, he kept getting the same notification over and over again. New notification, treasure discovered that can repair the system within the host's vicinity. The fact that the notification was repeating was not a bug. Rather, it was because he kept finding treasures that could be absorbed by the system. In just a brief moment, the notification had been triggered at least 6 or 7 times. As he continued to run, he caused even more notifications. It was such a sweet sorrow, such a painful joy to be surrounded by so much treasure knowing that he couldn't have it. To be specific, he could take any and all the herbs besides the ones with the Tao in them, yet as new herbs and flowers and grass and leaves began to absorb the aura, he had new obstacles to dodge. Maybe once the mist ended, and new treasures stopped forming, he could try his hand at grabbing a few things here and there. But for now, it was more important to get away from anything at all that showed signs of developing Tao aura. Truthfully speaking, if Lex were in a better condition, physically and mentally, he could have come up with a better way to avoid the Tao aura than just running around. However, given the migraine and his severely damaged spirit, this was the best Lex could do. On top of it all, he needed to focus on sealing his cultivation. Lex exerted his strained mind, trying to come up with a proper and appropriate recipe for a seal that would work on him. It wasn't like he could whip it out merely because he wanted to. He needed ingredients that could tolerate the strength of his cultivation as the most basic ingredients of the seal, and then forming the seal itself would be his second issue. As Lex searched through his spatial ring, he found countless things to help him increase his cultivation, but almost nothing to help him bind it. Lex took in a deep breath, and almost immediately regretted it because he inhaled a bunch of the mist. It was formed of an energy Lex was completely unfamiliar with, and was entirely incapable of controlling. It seamlessly merged into his body, strengthening it, healing it, helping it grow. Amidst his desperation, Lex decided to throw caution to the wind. Although he wasn't necessarily in such a bad state just yet, he could not handle pressure so well while his mind suffered from the consequences of fragmentation. Lex ran towards a tree in the jungle and grabbed a hold of its bark, ripping it free even as the tree grew stronger and more valuable. He took a big gulp of the tree's sap even as he ran forward to grab another tree, taking away more bark. He gathered leaves, sticks, herbs and everything he could find, and began refining them together. He used the immense vitality in the numerous plants to treat the tree bark, even as he processed it to become thinner and more malleable, almost turning it into a fiber. At the same time, Lex crafted the crudest, most brute force seal he could at the moment. The seal would use the vitality of the plant itself to function. As it continued to seal Lex's cultivation, the vitality would be used up in maintaining the seal. Once the vitality was used up, the seal would break. It wasn't the best solution, but it would at least delay matters for a bit. In barely a dozen minutes, Lex refined all the bark into one long piece of cloth fiber, and wrapped it around his forehead, mimicking Rambo. Finally, for a brief moment, Lex felt his cultivation freeze, and resist the urge to upgrade. Yet the mist all around him was still being absorbed into his body, as well as into the headband he was wearing, continuing to strengthen it. Through the headband, Lex felt a cooling, relaxing sensation, as if his spirit was being healed. Lex's eyes reddened, and he came up with a drastic idea. He surveyed the ground around him, and after making sure there was nothing even remotely similar to Tao or nearby, sat down on the ground cross-legged and began cultivating at full force. Lex's body rapidly started to absorb the surrounding mist, forming a tornado, feeding his body. But since his cultivation was sealed, the energy instead focused on healing Lex and bringing him back into his peak state. At the same time, his headband also started to absorb energy, yet at the same time it was using up a tremendous amount of vitality to keep Lex's cultivation restrained. A delicate and transient equilibrium formed, yet Lex did not care. Like a madman, he continued to absorb the energy, brute forcing his way into health, allowing himself to quickly return to his peak state. But he was not there yet. Unfortunately, time waits for no man. The final midnight match ended at that exact moment. The midnight games had finally come to the end, and now, as the innkeeper, he not only needed to conclude the event, he needed to give out rewards. Chapter 16-17, Tao Mist. The end of the midnight games could not have been called a grand finale. It was not a tense moment, with a lot of unpredictability. Instead, it was something everyone saw coming. Even so, that did not mean it was any less entertaining, or significant. A few years ago, these insects had wrought untold havoc across the Origin realm. They were being altered so that their blood was corrosive to space, destroying large segments of the Origin realm and causing the growth of the realm to become unstable. For a realm that had the potential to become a major realm, such instability was unacceptable, so the Henali had gone on a great hunt for them, and the organization that nurtured them. Of course, the backstory of the games was something all the viewers were familiar with. While that was interesting, it was the setting of the actual games that everyone enjoyed far more. By pitting the insects against armies from countless worlds, armies of a similar level, so that neither side had an advantage over the other, the games created the perfect spectacle. Some might say that it was kind of cruel making armies fight in battles, risking their lives for enemies who weren't their real enemies. Of course, the majority of viewers didn't care about such a thing, but some might say such things. The inn, to a degree, even had an answer prepared for them. First off, not a single one of the armies were forced to fight. All of them signed up for the fights themselves. Secondly, for many of them, this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to not only train, but to achieve tangible growth in their powers and cultivation. So many of them were stuck in bottlenecks in their cultivation, or lacked the resources to grow, or maybe they lacked cultivation techniques. Maybe their cultivation talent itself was lacking. By entering the midnight games, they could, through their own efforts, attract gifts and donations from viewers, and overcome whatever barriers were blocking their paths. In a universe where the nature of existence was inherently unfair, providing such an opportunity was not only an immense mercy, it was almost saint-like. Of course, there were still many who did not necessarily agree with such sentiments. But since that was the view of the inn, they could only accept it. Once the final battle concluded, there was a moment of peace and odd reluctance. So many, participants and viewers alike, who did not wish for the event to be over so soon. Yet it could not be helped. The army that had been fighting the final battle was teleported to the Midnight Inn. All other armies who had concluded their fights earlier on were already there, waiting, recovering, resting. As soon as the final army arrived, a large coliseum appeared in the sky, lined with statues of warriors from every race that had taken part in the games. Yet the odd thing was, the coliseum was out of reach. No one could go to it, nor could anyone even fly close to it. It was as if it existed only to be seen and admired, not entered. But that didn't necessarily make sense. There was no time to think, however, as projections of the stage in the center of the Colosseum appeared in front of all to see. The sight was breathtaking, and not just because of how finely crafted the stage was, or its elaborate architecture, or the suggestive murals painted in the background, depicting scenes from the cultural show of the first Midnight Games. No, what took everyone's breath away was the sight of the innkeeper, sitting cross-legged on stage, with his eyes closed. It had been so long since the innkeeper made a public appearance, that seeing him now so suddenly surprised many. But for most, this was the first time they were seeing the innkeeper, so the real reason they gasped was because it was clear that this was merely a projection of the real innkeeper who was cultivating somewhere. A thin mist was almost visible, running over his skin before fusing into his body synchronously with his breathing. The sight alone shocked almost all viewers, because the sight of the mist gave them goosebumps, as if they had seen something they should not have. As if to emphasize exactly that point, the aura that the mist gave off was unlike anything that most in the inn had ever felt. There were only two in the inn who recognized that mist, the same mist that was nourishing Lex's body and healing him. When Lex had decided to act desperately, it was a mix of his inability to think too deeply in his given state, and his awareness that everything in and about the jungle was exceptionally rare or powerful. He intended to use items from his surroundings as rewards, use the aura from the jungle to raise his prestige, and also add further mystery to the background of the innkeeper. Though he was desperate, and such a risky act could have ended horribly, in this situation it ended up working exactly as he hoped, much better than he could have ever imagined. Wukong looked at the image of the innkeeper in complete silence, not a single emotion present in his expression. His thoughts, for once, were completely hidden. He didn't even crack a joke about it or anything. Elsewhere in the inn, a devil looked up at the projection and started to sweat heavily, fear and panic evident on his face. The devil did not hesitate at all before leaving the inn. He couldn't afford to delay in delivering his message. As soon as he returned to Garvitz, the devil immediately used a treasure to request an emergency meeting with his lord Balam. "What is it?" the Tao Lord asked, appearing in front of the devil immediately. "Were you finally able to make contact with the monkey?" "No, my lord," the devil said. "It's the innkeeper. He appeared in front of everyone, he. Balam frowned, and put a hand on the devil's shoulder, forcibly calming him down. "Speak. What happened?" "The innkeeper appeared in front of everyone, cultivating in Tao mist," the devil said, his body trembling despite Balam calming him down. "The aura is unmistakable. It's real, genuine Tao mist, and there's way too much of it. It's like he's declaring to the universe that he just killed more than one Tao Lord. No wonder his real body has been missing from." Balam immediately poked the devil, and froze his body and soul, lest he complete his thoughts. Balam yearned to enter the inn himself, to see the visage of the innkeeper. Unfortunately, as long as that crazy monkey was inside the inn, no other Tao Lord would be crazy enough to enter. He could not help but wonder who had made a move on the innkeeper. Weren't they a little too impatient? It hadn't even been a million years since the innkeeper appeared. What was all the rush? Whoever it was, they had clearly paid a great price. Within the midnight inn, the innkeeper opened his eyes, and a sudden weight blanketed the entire inn. Chapter 1618, I Want Grandchildren. Within 1 microsecond of Balaam learning news of the innkeeper cultivating in Dow Mist, a conference was called and held. Not all members, but many of the most important members of the humanoid alliance were present. The innkeeper is publicly projecting an image of himself cultivating in Dow Mist. I have not seen it myself, for entering the midnight inn is not something I want to risk, but I believe that the projection should not be false. The Dow Mist should be real, or there would be no point in projecting it publicly. What we need to figure out now is, who has he killed, and how? Pin-drop silence filled the conference room as everyone took in the shocking news. It had to be known that, despite many realm wars going on across the universe, the death of a single Dow Lord was a big deal. Comparatively speaking, there were no major wars going on in the universe. There were multiple smaller wars, but they were confined to one war per realm. It was rare for a single war to extend from one realm to another. As such, any actual Dow casualties were a minimum, if they occurred at all. In all seriousness, it was easier to seal or trap a Dow Lord than kill one, so that was the more common practice in wars. If that happened, the captured Dow Lord would be ransomed back to their original organization, and they would refrain from re-entering the same conflict. All of this was according to a silent, unspoken understanding that spanned the universe. So now, to see a single Dow Lord having killed multiple Dow Lords, and then to publicly use Dow Mist to cultivate was akin to the most brutal war declaration in the modern age. The universal karma is unchanged. No known Dow Lords have perished, said a celestial, with confusion. Balaam frowned. He communicated with the devils in the midnight inn, and called back over 1 million of them to Garvitz. Then from the memories of over 1 million devils, he pulled out the image of the innkeeper sitting cross-legged, his skin covered in mist. More importantly, he also captured their memory of what the aura felt like. Over 1 million memories confirm it. For now at least, it can basically be confirmed that the innkeeper is surrounded by real Dow Mist. That only means one thing. He can hide the karmic repercussions of killing a Dow Lord. Don't jump to conclusions, spoke an elf, his voice jittery and filled with disbelief. There are other explanations for this. There has to be. There's an urgent report from the Versailles Bank to all stakeholders, a dwarf suddenly interrupted, holding a newsletter. The bank is recognizing the midnight inn. He paused, and then looked up at Balaam in shock. He continued to speak, but his voice became unusually high-pitched. A motion has been submitted to recognize the midnight inn as the seat of power of the innkeeper. There's also a motion to open a new bank branch that will be discussed. The resolution based on the motion will be published in the next Giganum fiscal report. The primal race has been contacted to confirm the claim before the motion is presented onto the floor. Every single Dow Lord in the room looked towards the dwarf, and then looked towards Balaam. Balaam, on the other hand, had picked up his U-phone and directly called his daughter Lilith from across the void. "Hey, this is Lilith speaking," a cute voice spoke from the other side. "This is my personal phone, and I don't recognize the calling number." "Who is this and how did you get my number?" "Lilith, this is Dad," Balaam said, for the first time in his long life referring to himself like that. "When are you planning on marrying that boyfriend of yours?" "I'm not getting any younger, and I want to play with my grandchildren before my next billionth birthday." A stunned silence filled the room as they heard the sound of Lilith hanging up the call. She likely thought that it was a prank call. "Excuse me, gentlemen," Balaam said. "I need to attend to a matter." He disappeared, off to find his daughter and set a date for the wedding. Simultaneously, across the universe, many were learning about the midnight inn for the first time, mainly because of the bank's newsletter. The news about the Dow Mist had not spread just yet, but it would only be a matter of time before it did. Yet those inside the midnight inn did not know about this, nor did they care. The moment the innkeeper opened his eyes, all living beings within the midnight realm felt a weight fall upon their chest. It was as if the innkeeper's gaze could directly view, and even affect, their karma. No, that was not it. It was as if all of their karma itself had stopped working as it presented itself before the innkeeper, ready to be manipulated according to his will. Fortunately, the feeling lasted only a short moment. "What an event it has been," the innkeeper said, his voice echoing through space, affected by the mist. Lex did not know it just yet, but his system was also recovering, as well as being affected by the Dao mist. The changes were not drastic just yet, for Dao mist did not actually contain any Dao. Even so, it was one of the most nourishing things in existence, if only because of its long-term effects. These games, as we call them, are not games because we sit in seats and watch the competitors from high above. We are not lording over others, acting superior. In fact, we, who observe, are merely spectators for those valiant warriors who play with the strings of destiny, and weave their own story. Treating fate as a game, and playing with it as we wish, that is the essence of the Midnight Games. This time around, we had entire armies fighting for the right to improve their lives, and in the process, cleansed a realm of some malediction. Their valor, their sacrifices, their bravery, all of them are things we will never forget. Of course, as Lex gave this speech, he had already forgotten everything, because 3 Subway sandwiches away from him, a wildweed was growing, and it was developing the aura that belonged to the Tao. The problem was, when he tried to run, the weed looked at him angrily, so Lex had no choice but to continue sitting, and continue absorbing the mist. Oh right, he was also giving a speech. Chapter 1619, Here, have some mist. A few seconds went by, and the innkeeper said nothing. This pause, this unanticipated delay in his speech allowed everyone to ruminate over his words. The essence of the Midnight Games was to treat fate as a game? If the innkeeper had such a thing about himself, none would have doubted his words. But the thing was, he likened himself to a spectator, just like the others, and turned these few, weak armies on such a high pedestal. It was nigh unbelievable, and yet it was true. They tasted the flavors of his words, and found it deep and rich. Could any of them deny the truth of his words? At the beginning of these games, each and every participant was a nobody. They were the lowest of the low, without a heritage, without powerful backing, without innate strengths or bloodlines that would turn them into elites. Each of them was at the end of their cultivation journey, and the only thing that they had was a resolute heart, and a mission. Some of them fought to protect their worlds. Some of them fought for revenge. Others fought because they were paid to. A few even fought because they were searching for death. Yet through the process, what they attained was something elite from across the realm would envy. They got recognition. They got opportunities. Their cultivation talents were improved, their old wounds healed, their futures changed. Indeed, none could deny that these mortals, no more significant in the grand scheme of things than a single grain of sand in a desert, had through the Midnight Games played with fate, and come out the victors. Finally, the innkeeper spoke again. Mortals play games of chess. Kings and rulers play the game of thrones. Cultivators play a game of defiance, going against what they were born with, striving for greater power, for a greater horizon. But here, during the Midnight Games, we play against the bounds of causality, against the limitations of birth, against all who would stand in our way. Play, and all you stand to lose is your life. For a cultivator on the path to the peak, the threat of death is a constant companion. It is there in the dark, where even the faintest of light fears to enter. It is present in the light, under the glorious banners of the righteous. When you are all alone, it accompanies you closer than your dearest sweetheart, and when you are with friends, it is always a part of the crowd. To say you are a cultivator, and then to not risk your life is a contradiction. So when the Midnight Games are played, all you stand to lose is your life. But what you stand to gain, is everything. Lex could not retrieve things from the inn to himself because they could not enter his system inventory. But at any time, he could submit what he was holding to the gift shop to be sold, given that there were no restrictions on the item itself. Similarly, he could deposit anything in his possession to the inn to be used as a reward for the games. The reason the weed plant had developed a Dao aura was because Lex hadn't absorbed enough of the mist around him to heal. Oddly enough, he couldn't absorb this mist as he normally absorbed other energy, which created a bottleneck. However, he could do something else. Just as he finished speaking, he started channeling the mist towards his system, using it as an additional reward for all the armies who participated in the games. Although this mist was incredibly potent, and a little unusual, since it hadn't caused a huge change in his body like the chaos amber resin had, Lex figured that it wasn't too precious. The herbs and weeds around him probably had more value, so he could use those as main gifts. A little mist, however, didn't seem bad as a small side offering. So, just as the echoes of the innkeeper's last words finished, a thin mist enveloped all the armies, right in plain view of all those watching. Wukong's jaw dropped. This was not something he had anticipated at all. Each and every participant who entered the midnight games suddenly closed their eyes and fell into a trance, their bodies greedily absorbing the mist. But they weren't the only ones. The midnight realm itself began to greedily absorb the mist, and the rate of its growth suddenly shot up. The galactic sovereign turtle, who was minding his own business and not at all enticing a local forest into forming a pantheon of deities for his fledgling heaven project, suddenly turned and looked towards the projection of the innkeeper. He inhaled, and some of the mist suddenly flew all the way over to him and entered his lungs. "This is good stuff," he muttered, and quickly captured a bit and stored it inside his shell, to be used at a later date for a personal project of his. Simultaneously, many groups across the universe who had no idea about what was happening in the Midnight Inn, suddenly started holding meetings, for there was a sudden fluctuation in the universal karma. Actually, fluctuation was too tame a word to describe what happened. A karmic tsunami had struck the universe, and no one could figure out why. It only made sense. After all, it was no longer possible to divine things about the Midnight Inn. Any divination or prophecy that pointed at the inn, now automatically pointed towards the one heaven that made up the universe. It was a good thing too, or else greed would have caused someone to do something drastic. As it was, the arrival of the mist only lasted a couple of seconds, despite Lex's attempts to send more back. For some reason, he could not figure out, his system could no longer detect the mist. Deep within the van, an angry Kuan Peng was staring at Lex and grumbling to himself, while many others just watched along and chuckled. Chapter 1620, Negotiation. "He's a thief," grumbled Mr. Big Fat Guy. "Since when do you care about a little bit of Dao mist?" another voice asked. "What do you mean? That's a valuable resource that cannot be wasted. The existence of the jungle depends on it. The mist comes, and the mist goes. Don't worry about it. This is not your domain, anyway. You should instead worry about what you'll give him when he makes it here." "What do you mean?" "I'm giving him nothing. You guys cheated. He was going to die within the barrier until you suddenly decided to help him out." "Prove it." Silence followed, as the Kuan Peng had no way to respond, but that didn't improve its mood. All he could do was turn and look towards Lex and grumble. Lex, who was still absorbing the mist himself but could no longer send it to the inn, lamented at his inability to send the mist. He didn't really care either way. It was just that he wanted to deprive the weed in front of him of the mist. He diverted his attention back to the midnight games. All the members of the various armies had entered into spontaneous meditation, probably undergoing improvements in their cultivation. That meant that the final award ceremony needed to be delayed until they were all ready, which was just fine with him. It would give him time to find more rewards to pass out. As the innkeeper, he looked around the inn once more, observing all the viewers, and noticed something odd. He could sense a mild change in the karma of his guests, but couldn't really tell what caused the change, or what the consequences would be. Given his current state, he could not think too much on the matter. He had to focus on himself first. "To those of you who watched, and supported the armies in their battles, thank you for being an important part of the games," the innkeeper said, still sitting cross-legged. "To those of you who fought, thank you for letting us witness your courage. The Midnight Inn welcomes all so long as they obey the rules of the inn, and we look forward to seeing everyone participating in the many more events to come. To the victors, the rewards will not disappoint. But for the sake of confidentiality, the rewards will not be imparted publicly. However, for those curious, just know that none of the rewards will be anything that can be used by others in case anyone has more unsavory intentions towards these armies. I will now leave the stage for others. After all, the Midnight Inn is not just made up by me. It is made up by a team of highly capable workers, and it is made up of the most amazing guests, and each of us has a part to play in the Midnight Inn. So while I go and deal with this weed, rest assured you will be well taken care of. The innkeeper's projection suddenly disappeared, leaving many confused regarding what he was referring to when he mentioned a weed. In truth, that was not something Lex would have ordinarily done. Yet his limited spirit, alongside his aching migraine, and the weed with a Tao aura constantly harassing him, he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He broke from the pattern of a perfectly composed innkeeper he wanted to portray as his attention diverted towards staying alive. Yet the consequence of it was not negative. Instead, a message had been left behind, and for those who recognized the Tao mist, it hinted to an earth-shattering possibility. Was the innkeeper hosting the games while still fighting other Tao lords? Respect. Unrestrained respect shone in Wukong's eyes as he thought about the innkeeper. He decided right then and there that when he grew up, he wanted to be more like the innkeeper. Of course, he was already incredibly old, but at heart, Wukong was still 16 years old, so saying as much wasn't wrong. While Ash came up on stage, and talked about some of the new features and services that the inn would be launching, specifically targeting mortals, Lex had put his thoughts about the games behind him. Instead, he was focusing on the weed. The plant, with each of its 7 leafy tips, was pointing towards Lex angrily, as if it recognized that he had stolen its mist. Yet, for some reason, it was content to merely scolding and threatening him. It did not take any action towards him. As sanity was slowly returning to Lex, he no longer acted out in desperation, and instead evaluated the situation. He noticed that in the jungle all around him, no plant was interfering with the absorption of the mist of another even if they already had a Tao aura developed. Could it be that there was some kind of rule in place? Maybe that's why he was stopped from plundering the mist. He could use it himself, but not give it to others. Okay, look, I'm sorry, said Lex, holding up his hands disarmingly. But you see all the other things carrying Tao aura all around. What am I supposed to do? I can only run around to avoid it, or absorb the mist as quickly as possible to heal my injuries. The weed used its leafy limbs to communicate with Lex in sign language, offering it a proposal. That could work, but I want to continue absorbing the mist as well. The weed angrily negotiated with Lex, threatening him, yet for some reason Lex was not intimidated. After a couple of rounds of back and forth, they came to an agreement. Lex scooted closer to the weed, but still out of range, and began sucking the mist towards him once more, forming a whirlwind of mist. Yet he limited himself to actually absorbing the mist at 50% of his max speed. The rest was sent to the weed, as an apology for stealing from him, and as a form of protection money. The weed would, in exchange, protect him from all other things with Tao aura. It was a pretty even trade in his opinion. Chapter 1621, Blade of Eternal Echoes. For about a little over 20 minutes, Lex continued to absorb the mist, using it to fix and heal his body rather than further his cultivation. His condition, which would have required months to heal with the help of the recovery pod, was already near perfectly healed, showing just how remarkable the mist really was. But as Lex's condition improved, he realized that he had drastically underestimated the value of the mist. Anything in the universe that was even remotely connected to the Tao was immensely powerful and rare, and if exposure of this mist could allow random plants to develop an aura of Tao, then this mist's ability exceeded anything he had ever heard of. In fact, it would be in his best opinion to absorb as much of it as possible, and even store it for later use. Unfortunately, he could not store it in any way. Actually, it also finally occurred to Lex that he had no idea what the effects of the mist were, and that it might be adverse to him, like maybe trapping him in the forest. But it was a little too late to consider that now. What's strange was that, for once, neither his body, spirit or soul were showing signs that they wanted it. For example, when he encountered the amber chaos resin, he was actually overwhelmed by how much his body wanted it. Now, though, there was nothing but from the rate at which he had healed, not to mention how it had forcibly pushed his cultivation towards the next level, and the fact that it had nourished an entire jungle, he could tell that it was incredibly valuable. Oh, there was also the little thing about his dragon heart going absolutely crazy over the mist. It was fortunate that he had complete control over his body, or else he feared that his heart might develop its own consciousness and tear itself out of his body to get at the mist. Before he could discover the mystery of the mist, however, it finally thinned out, returning the jungle to the way it was. Lex opened his eyes and studied the jungle. He discovered, much to his relief, that the Tao aura that the weed in front of him disappeared alongside the mist. It was still incredibly powerful, but it had returned to acting as a simple weed, showing no indication of being sentient or, more importantly, being angry at Lex. Seeing how calm things were in the jungle, and seeing how nothing ridiculous had happened within the Midnight Inn, Lex shrugged. Maybe the mist wasn't as incredible as he thought it was. Or, much more realistically, the effects of the mist would take much longer to show themselves. What Lex did know, however, was that without the mist, his headband stopped replenishing its energy. It would not last long, and he needed to come up with a decent seal before that happened. Lex was not ready to break through to the next realm just yet. The immortal realms, he'd concluded, were much more about mastery of control over laws than anything else, and he hadn't reached the pinnacle of his control over laws just yet. If anyone else heard Lex, a human who could unleash a domain as an earth immortal due to the immense control he had over laws, state that his control over laws was lacking, they'd whack him in the head. But the thing was, Lex wasn't comparing himself to other ordinary immortals. He was comparing himself to the best of the best, the most mythical of the mythical races, the prime of the primordials, the creme de la creme of the universe, and among those, he was still ordinary. Lex flexed his hands, trying to see if he got some secret power-up but didn't notice, yet discovered nothing for now. He turned his attention to the white hill in the distance, the Van. That is where Fenrir and the others disappeared, and by now Lex could pretty much guess that whoever took them was most definitely a whole lot stronger than Lex. If he decided to continue the chase, the chances of actually being able to confront such an entity were nil. I really wish I had the strongest butter knife on me, he muttered, and looked away. No matter what, he was not going to abandon Fenrir and Little Blue without at least trying to get them back. If there was one thing he had learned in life, it was that nothing was set in stone. The words he had spoken as the Innkeeper, though somewhat delirious, reflected his true thoughts. He would follow them into the hill, but first, he would see what he could salvage from this jungle. Just to test things out, he plucked a single blade of grass from the floor and sent it to the gift shop. It successfully disappeared. He glanced at the gift shop, just to read its description before removing it, but paused the moment he did. Suddenly, Lex remembered what he had been told about joint quests. The reason they had no reward was because the ability to go on such a quest was the reward itself. He looked down at the ground, covered in grass, and let his greed overflow for a brief moment. Then he controlled himself. He did not believe for even a second that a treasure as valuable as this jungle was just left unprotected for anyone to take advantage of. Upon slight reflection, the ban on absorbing the mist into the system was likely a subtle warning to him to not overdo things. That also likely meant that there was some limit to which he could harvest things from the jungle without causing a backlash or restriction. While Lex was thinking of how he could maximize his gains from the jungle, a dragon walked into the gift shop, led there by its instincts. The dragons had come to watch Jotun fight, and had stayed back because the Midnight Inn was a proverbial treasure hoard just waiting to be plucked. Of course, after seeing the Innkeeper, the dragon didn't even dare to think of plucking this treasure, which is why it came to the gift shop to grab some souvenirs. Naturally, as a dragon, he started by looking at the most expensive item available, and that's when its jaw dropped. Blade of Eternal Echoes, 1,000,000 metric tons. Chapter 1622, Regal Twig of Majestic Excellence. Blade of Eternal Echoes, 1,000,000 metric tons. It is no sword, though it bears the name blade. A single stalk of grass, yet it has endured, It has endured time itself, and the long silence between ages that even legends could not bear. Found in the lands abandoned, the lands forgotten, the blade itself remembers. When the lords fell, it was there. When new lords rose, it was there. When wars were waged, it was there, and when the warriors fell, it remained. Those who dare consume the blade are granted sight. They see the echoes. They are drawn into the weft and weave of time itself, to witness the place as it once was. Not in metaphor. Not in legend. In truth. The cave will whisper, the tree will bleed, the stone will sing. And sometimes, things left behind notice the one who watches. Sometimes, they reach back. This is the blade of eternal echoes. Consume it only if you must. And only where you are ready to remember, or to be remembered. Prerequisites to purchase Blade of Eternal Echoes, Privilege Tier 9, Personal Writ of Approval from the Innkeeper. The dragon read the description of the blade once, and then he read it again, and then just to be absolutely sure, he read it a third time. Was it a blade of grass that had witnessed the death of multiple Tao lords? A blade of grass that had lived through 3 ages? Wouldn't that make this blade of grass a primordial? As if that was not enough, the blade of grass had powers that had something to do with time. Yet it was being sold for a measly 1 million metric tons? He didn't believe it. The price was likely just a formality. The real difficulty was attaining Privilege Tier 9 at the Midnight Inn, as well as getting a writ of approval from the Innkeeper. It was likely bait to attract some deals, or exchanged for treasures that had no real price. After all, the dragon knew that so far, no one had attained more than Tier 5 privilege regardless of how much they spent. The dragon immediately checked the second most expensive item, and upon confirming that it was nothing like the Blade of Eternal Echoes, it confirmed that the blade was likely there to tempt someone of real power and influence. The dragon immediately exited the gift shop to quickly go inform the Dragon King about this. Something like this would be extremely valuable in the Origin realm, which held incredible secrets that no one had yet uncovered. Lex spent about half an hour scouting the jungle, taking note of everything within the vicinity of the VAN that he wanted to get. He could not explore the whole jungle, for the jungle was far larger than his spirit sense could detect, and he didn't have the time to spare. He decided to start gathering the items from most valuable to the least, in case he was blocked again. But before that, Lex bowed towards the jungle. Please excuse me for my intrusion. I do not know the rules here, so if I am overstepping, please let me know. I just want to collect a few items here to help out some people I know. Thank you for your understanding. He had no idea if the jungle was sentient, or there was some guardian, or a number of guardians, but it couldn't hurt to be polite. In fact, his politeness helped him out a lot more than he knew. After he picked up the blade of grass and sent it to the inn, Mr. Big Fat Guy had decided to prevent him from taking anything else, whether he used it for himself or sent it to his accursed system. Yet as a result, the others pressured him into letting Lex take a single item more. The most valuable item Lex found, at least according to his dragon senses which gauged the value of treasures, was a cool-looking stick. The stick consisted of 2 parts. The first, straight and long portion, while the second started at what Lex considered the base of the stick, turning and twisting into forming a handle, before wrapping around the rest of the stick's body, forming a second layer. As a result, it looked like a sword with the handle of a Spanish sword, pretty cool if he said so himself. But, despite the shape, Lex sensed no sword intent from it. He guessed that its effect would be something else, yet he would have to wait till he entered it into the gift shop to know. It certainly felt a lot more incredible than the random blade of grass he picked up. The fact that the blade of grass had the longest description he had ever seen from the gift shop, as well as only a vague description of what it did instead of an outright explanation, indicated how truly valuable it was. So the stick in the shape of a Spanish sword, which felt even more valuable, was likely even more incredible. Lex was tempted to keep the sword for himself. But, honestly, Lex had become somewhat numb to valuable things. He could keep it for the inn and give it to his workers, but since his original intention had been to use it as a reward for the midnight games, he decided to stay true to his intentions. After all, he was literally surrounded by the whole jungle. It was full of sticks. He could grab as many as he wanted. Little did he know, he couldn't grab as many as he wanted. He sent the stick back to the inn, and was relieved to see that it went. He saw its description in the gift shop and his smile froze. What? Regal twig of majestic excellence. He who holds the regal twig of majestic excellence becomes most exceptional. None in his presence can deny his distinction, and none without his presence can say otherwise. Chapter 1623, Enemies in the Dark. Just like with the Blade of Eternal Echoes, Lex had to read the description of the item more than once before he was certain he got it right. Unlike the blade, which only had a vague description of its function, the twig had a clear-cut description. The problem was, the function, while not entirely pointless, lacked that special oomph that Lex had been expecting. Oh well. Lex shrugged, and decided the twig could go to the leader of the army who came first in the games. With that, he removed the twig from the gift shop, submitted it as a reward, and went to transfer the next item. Unfortunately, no matter what he did, he wasn't able to transport the item away, as if a restriction had been placed. In fact, Lex couldn't even place it in any of his spatial equipment. He either needed to use it right then and there, or give up on it. He reluctantly looked at everything in the jungle, and finally got a sense for what some of his guests felt like. His mortal guests that came to the inn were always forced to see countless invaluable treasures all around them, but were never able to use them. Of course, it wasn't that the treasures weren't usable, but that the guests would have to pay for it, and that was often not viable. He was sure that was the situation here too. While it seemed like everything was available for him to use, the constant prohibitions he was facing was a clear indication that he was being watched. Lex could try his hand at grabbing some resources for himself to use right then and there, but given his situation he really couldn't cultivate, and making a seal would take time he didn't want to spend while Fenrir and Little Blue were still in potential peril. Suppressing the greed in his heart, Lex turned towards the van and investigated the White Hill. Although it was a little late, and Lex doubted that it would actually help, Lex used his best stealth techniques so as to attract as little attention as possible. Considering that he hadn't thought of doing this earlier on first because he was unconscious, and later because of the migraine and damaged spirit, it was likely he had already been exposed to anyone who was watching out for him. He did it anyway. It was the principle that mattered. The issue now was how to get inside. The White Hill looked completely solid to him, and even when Lex touched it, he felt no opening on its side. He sent his energy inside, investigated with his spirit and his soul, and tried various common incantations like Open Sesame, to no avail. He observed it through his karmic vision, and his other enhanced sights, and utilized every bit of his experience and knowledge, yet the opening within the hill refused to reveal itself. For the moment, it seemed that he was stumped. He turned to look at the weed, wondering if it would give him any hints due to the deep and long-lasting friendship, yet the weed had returned to being just another ordinary plant in the jungle. With no solution in sight, all Lex could do was explore the jungle around the hill and search for the method to reveal the opening. Simultaneously, he mentally managed the rewards for the Midnight Games. With well over 300 billion MP, and just a little over 31,000 metric tons, Lex finally had a stable enough reserve to be able to operate the inn without fear of running short of MT. That seemed to be the more important currency these days anyway. As such, even if he could not personally find truly unique rewards to give everyone, simply relying on the rewards available through the system were good enough. He also had to plan for the next big event. As long as he did not entirely close the inn to the whole universe, he would need to continuously rely on the security that events provided. So far, the Midnight Games had been the perfect event, as it provided him with a lot of income and lasted a long time, not to mention it helped him eradicate some pests. Now, though, he wanted an event that was less focused on combat. After all, he was running an inn. It couldn't be focused on fighting all the time. Taking inspiration from the first segment of the previous Midnight Games, as well as an event he had previously based on theme and amusement parks, Lex decided that his next segment would be a cultural event with elements of a circus. It would go perfectly well with the cozy and comfortable environment of the inn. That was for later, though. For now, he went through the selection of rewards, and picked one out, each suiting the army they were supposed to go to. What he did not know was that as he observed the inn, and silently monitored the minor details, ensuring everything ran smoothly, the beings from inside the van were doing the same thing for the jungle. The only thing was, since Mr. Big Fat Guy had a particular dislike for Lex, they had all taken an interest in him. Seeing as how he had slowed down their entertainment by being unable to detect the opening, they began to plot amongst themselves about how to push him in the right direction. Yet even that needed due consideration. Getting him to find the opening was not hard, but this was a rare opportunity, so they had to enjoy themselves while they did it. As a result, they discussed things amongst themselves, and all came to the same conclusion. An undefeatable foe who would strike terror in the hearts of its victims to push Lex in the right direction sounded like a good idea. As soon as it was decided, they implemented the idea. Lex, who had just spent a chunk of change on his rewards, and was looking forward to everyone's reactions, suddenly turned to look into the jungle behind him. He began to sense a grave threat towards him there, in the darkness created by the canopy. The fact that he could not see through the darkness was, in itself, a great indication of how abnormal it was. He squinted his eyes and pulled out his sword, ready to face whatever challenge awaited him. That's when he saw something shine in the darkness, and felt like his eyes were playing tricks on him. After all, how could it be possible? How could one of the greatest universal terrors of Earth show up here, in Abaddon? He had to be mistaken. Unfortunately, he was not. Chapter 1624, What in the Bloody Hell? Lex had not forgotten that Abaddon was a dangerous place. Even though the jungle was a mystery unto itself, seemingly defying the otherwise set rules of this land, that did not mean it was a friendly place. The jungle felt wrong, just in a different way than Abaddon. But the odd sense of acceptance that the jungle gave him was likely what allowed Lex to avoid the dangers of it so far. That did not mean that the jungle wasn't a dangerous place. Just the barrier alone had nearly killed Lex in a way he still did not understand. Lex looked towards the darkness in the jungle, trying to identify the threat. Oddly, he became hyper-aware of his surroundings at that moment. The jungle stretched endlessly in all directions. No rustle of wings. No chirp of crickets. Only plants, gnarled roots that coiled like veins across the moss-laden earth, trees that leaned too closely together, blotting out the sky in a tangle of silent judgment. A few thin streaks of light broke through the canopy in front of him, but deeper into the forest there was only darkness. For a moment he saw a flash of light, maybe a reflection of some kind, yet he did not catch what it was. Tired of the games, Lex withdrew Naraka. Since when had he been afraid of danger? But it seemed that drawing his sword did the trick. Whatever hid in the darkness was provoked. He felt it. A pressure. Like fingers curling slowly around his spine. The air grew heavier. Colder. He stared into the shadow beneath the canopy, scanning. He heard the distinct sound of metal hitting metal, and something shimmered once more. A glint of metal, small and deliberate, flashed once between the branches. Then it flashed again, closer now. Cold light dancing off polished steel. He drew his sword, ready to meet the opponent's weapons. But then his instinct spoke. This was a different kind of enemy, who wielded different kinds of weapons. Then, from the darkness, it emerged. A man, no, not a man, a figure stepped forward. Dressed in pristine white, untouched by the grime of the jungle. His eyes were obscured by the shadows of the trees, but his smile, it gleamed with unnatural precision. In one gloved hand, he held a mirror. In the other, a metal hook. A probe. A drill. Lex knew what this abomination was. It was a dentist. No, not a dentist. A dentist in the dark. What in the bloody hell? Lex exclaimed. The tools clicked together in the figure's hand like bones snapping, and he took a step towards Lex, his smile growing unnaturally wide. The jungle seemed to hold its breath. Of course, that was because there were a bunch of ancient beings watching with anticipation, but Lex couldn't know that. "You've been neglecting your visits," the dentist said, his voice smooth, clinical, and empty of warmth. "It's because my teeth are self-cleaning, and they grow back if they get knocked out," Lex said, not that he was in the mood for a conversation. The dentist was a heaven immortal, and not a weak one at that. Now, generally speaking, Lex wasn't one to stereotype people. As an owner, that was a bad habit to have. But in this situation he felt pretty safe saying that the dentist was evil and needed to be put down. "Oh really?" he said, turning on his drill, its high-pitched squeal reminding Lex of memories he'd rather kept forgotten. "In that case, let me take a look. Don't take this the wrong way, but I'm not keen on having another guy poking around inside my mouth," Lex said, and swung his sword. He swung not at the dentist, but at the shadow of the tree beside him. As it happened, just as he swung, the dentist emerged from that shadow, his drill aiming towards Lex's mouth. Instead of Lex's teeth, the drill found Naraka's edge, ready and eager to cut down this accursed abomination. This was Lex's first true clash with a heaven immortal, and it was against an incredibly strong one. Though Lex's strength did not lose out against the dentist, he fell to an immediate and immense disadvantage. Lex jumped back, trying to gain a moment to gather himself. A single clash was enough for him to feel the difference. It was not about strength. No, the advantage he held was of direct superiority in every way. The quality of his energy, the magnitude of his strength, the depth of his law control, they were all leagues apart. Let alone a heaven immortal, even if Lex had the physical strength of a celestial, in a proper fight, he would still be at a disadvantage against a heaven immortal. The core reason for this, Lex gathered, was not all the other advantages that heaven immortals had. It came down to two things. Heaven immortals could control stronger laws than earth immortals could even detect, and their tenets were much stronger. It was these two simple things which made it nigh impossible for immortals to usually fight above their realm. Usually. Lex grinned. "Do you want to know something? I always eat candy right before bed. Come see if that made a difference." "Do you take dental hygiene as a joke?" the dentist roared, bringing out his plaque blaster and shooting a highly pressurized jet of water at Lex. But that's exactly what Lex wanted. He wanted to fight. He wanted to hone himself. More importantly, he wanted to understand where this dentist came from and why he came out now. Lex was certain that discovering this would be the key to discovering a way to enter inside the White Hill. His instincts told him so. Lex unleashed his domain, and swung Naraka using his greatest strength, leveraging two of his abilities which surpassed the Earth realm, and entered the Heaven realm. If 2 were not enough, he'd use 3. If 3 were not enough, then he'd use 4. If he ran out of advantages, then he'd just force his way into detecting the deeper laws, the ones that still hid from him. There was no way in hell or in Abaddon that he was going to let another dentist try to put braces on him. He just wasn't. Chapter 1625, Talk to the Hand 2.0. Even as Lex fought against the dentist, his disadvantage still pretty significant, he continued to pay attention to his surroundings as well. He did not believe, even for a second, that there was just a dentist randomly waiting inside the jungle, past the barrier, for him to arrive. It was much more likely that the dentist was summoned, or maybe even created, specifically as a result of his actions. Maybe he was finally being punished for taking things from the jungle. That meant there was still a possibility of more such enemies popping up out of the shadows. There was also the fact that his instincts were so clearly guiding him that the dentist hid the secret to following Fenrir. As of late, as Lex encountered more and more powerful beings, his instincts became less effective. This wasn't because his instincts had weakened. On the contrary, as an immortal, they were far stronger than they had ever been. It was just that, now that he himself was stronger, he was more frequently encountering things related to the Tao, or perhaps even beyond. His poor instincts, no matter how useful, could do little to help with that. But a mere dentist was no problem for him. Using the ability of his left eye, the one that allowed him to see through everything, Lex studied how the dentist manipulated laws. Even though there were many laws he manipulated that Lex couldn't sense, he could still observe how the more common laws were influenced as a result of his actions. The first thing he realized was that the dentist's tools, the drill, the saw, the plaque blaster, were actually a solidified lawcraft. He had literally created a physical object out of laws, and Lex was certain that he wasn't quite at the level where he could do that yet. But Lex could definitely try improving the way he used lawcraft. Since Lex had never created any before, he had been working on a couple lawcrafts which were basically just improved versions of techniques he already used. Lex and the dentist clashed. Lex's fragile domain, fragile in front of the accursed dentist, though it was usually quite sturdy against earth immortals, quivered, almost buckling under the weight of the dentist trying to use his drill. But the might of Lex's strength, channeled through Naraka, was enough to cause the dentist to stumble. For a fraction of a second, the dentist's concentration wavered, and that's when Lex employed his first lawcraft, an upgraded version of Golden Inferno. There were no fancy visuals, no appearance of a dragon. No, it was quick and brutal. Lex opened his mouth, and from it emerged his domination-imbued flames that transcended the concept of temperature. It was an expression of his supremacy tenet. Anything and everything that touched the flames was consumed by it, turned into fuel to allow the flames to burn brighter, stronger, and longer. It did not matter what was combustible, nor did it matter if the target even had a burning point at all. Even the effects and consequences of laws themselves began to burn. The dentist's wide smile wavered as his white coat was burnt to cinders, though he himself escaped relatively unharmed. "You're being a difficult patient," the dentist said, glaring at Lex. "I can sense your cavities from all the way over here. They've traveled through your teeth into your bones. Let me see what I can do to help." Lex was going to scoff, but suddenly discovered that he felt a soft numbness in his molars. The numbness traveled quickly into his jaw, and then began spreading around his skull and down his neck. Just as the dentist had said, a cavity had formed, and it was affecting his bones. Despite observing the dentist closely, he had no idea how it had been able to achieve such a thing, not that it mattered. Lex began to heal himself using his blood, and focused on the dentist. He did not find it difficult to believe that the dentist had avoided his flames. But he had sensed that, as soon as he used the flames, the dentist had grown just a little stronger, exactly enough to escape the flames unharmed. It seemed that he would not be able to win this fight in a normal way. Someone or something was making sure of that. No matter. He had more lawcrafts to test, and that would give him time to figure something else out. Lex took a step back, as if retreating, which only caused the dentist to lunge forward and attack with his drill. This time, Lex had neither his domain ready, nor had he raised Naraka in defense. Instead, he simply held up his empty hand and showed the dentist his palm. When Lex had merely begun his cultivation journey, he had learned a defensive technique called Talk to the Hand, which basically summoned an invisible barrier in front of his hand. It was not too strong, but it had served Lex well at the time. Inspired by that, as well as his need to refocus on his defense once again lest he fall behind in it, Lex created a new and improved version of Talk to the Hand. Unlike the original, a barrier was not summoned right in front of his palm, nor did he need to keep it up to use it. Raising his hand was just the way to activate the technique, and it would summon a barrier of any shape and size anywhere within Lex's reach. Moreover, he used the inspiration he gained when he saw the Black Knight's armor. Since the armor itself contained laws, penetrating its defenses was that much harder because it was like breaking a law itself. Of course, this was not foolproof, as Lex himself had broken a law or two, but it was definitely a nice bonus. The dentist's drills clashed against an invisible wall, bouncing back, right before it reached Lex. Lex had just tanked the full strength of the dentist's attack with a single defensive lawcraft, and that caused him to smile. He had been worried that he had been falling behind in his defense. It was good to know that wasn't the case. But it was too soon to celebrate. As the dentist retreated, Lex could sense him becoming stronger again. Chapter 1626, Selfish Oath. "Try though you might, you cannot escape from your appointment," the dentist said, his wide grin beginning to appear very grating to Lex. "You might want to get yourself checked out first," Lex said. "You have tremendously bad breath." probably tonsils. You should stay quiet to spare yourself the embarrassment of letting others find out. The dentist clenched his teeth and glared at Lex. Give up, human, the dentist finally said, dropping the facade. His voice became impossible deep, and carried a power to it that affected Lex even behind his barrier. Talk to the hand version too had not elapsed, but Lex could sense that it was strained. The dentist's power was rising exponentially, meaning that he was no longer suitable to test the techniques he had come up with. There was, however, one last thing Lex still wanted to try. Dr. Charles and Ragnar were working together to find a way to cure the zombification process, and for that they were creating a body cultivation technique that could fight it. Relying on holy aura was one solution, but since it was the sole domain of angels, it was not easy to get their hands on. Though the paladin, a smaller human force, somehow also had access to an energy similar to that. Lex had looked into their methods, and soon realized why, despite having an incredibly powerful cultivation system on their hands, why they weren't able to grow as large or influential as a traditional cultivation force. It was because their method of cultivation, while direct, was incredibly difficult and stringent, and was not suitable for the masses. It required an oath, and though the oath could be anything, the paladins had concentrated their research and study and distilled 3 highly effective oaths that most chose from. It was a path dedicated to justice and helping the weak. Any selfishness, any weakness of character, any action that might even seem good but went against the core creeds or oaths, would result in a backlash, causing them to become oathbreakers. The oathbreakers, too, could cultivate but were considered sworn enemies of the paladin order. Their history as well as social and political complexities, while interesting, were not what Lex was focusing on. He wanted to study their path to power to try and understand how exactly they gained access to the holy aura. If he could understand it, then he could help Ragnar, someone Lex genuinely looked up to. As such, after studying for a long time, Lex wanted to try his own hand at their cultivation path. Of course, he was not going to rely on the paladin's oath, he had come up with one that suited him much more. Although, according to their path, the more stringent the oath, the greater the feedback and power, Lex did not intend on properly following a paladin's path to begin with. He just needed a proper oath to which he could be entirely sincere. Now, against this formidable foe, in this capricious environment, he had found the perfect opportunity to take his oath and see how it affected things. But this was not something he could do casually. A paladin's oath was no joke, and had very stringent requirements, not only in terms of the oath, but from the individual paladin as well, or else their unique holy power would never be born within them. Give up? Lex repeated the dentist's words, his casual smile slowly fading as he put himself in the right state of mind. Give up on what exactly? Give up on fighting you? Give up on finding my nakama? Oh no, I meant friends? Lex was not smiling anymore, his eyes fixed onto the dentist, trying to see into his very being. He was tempted very seriously to use that lawcraft. The one he had been working on for a long time. The one that used up all his body's physical strength. But no, that lawcraft was something he had reserved for a very special target. It could not be used on others, not yet. Instead, he renewed his focus on his oath. He had not even said the words yet he could feel an unknown power gathering around him, with his very soul at its epicenter. Lex could vaguely sense something familiar in that power, but for once his perfect memory failed him. He could not recall where he had felt it before, or at least, felt something similar to it. It seemed even the dentist sensed the power gathering around Lex, and looked at him hesitantly, studying what he was doing. I was minding my own business before your forest pulled us towards it, and lured Little Blue in. What could you even want with a helpless little whale? Lex asked, though he did not expect the dentist to be behind the scheme. Do you think that just being powerful affords you the right to do as you wish? Or did you think that everyone would just go along with what you wanted? Lex was no longer speaking merely to the dentist. He was speaking to the power behind the dentist. Some might consider provoking a more powerful enemy foolish. But Lex, no longer constrained from an injured spirit, had come to a few conclusions of his own. He was aware of what had happened in the castle, and when Z learned that the armies outside would never be able to destroy the jungle, Lex had learned it too. He did not believe even for a second that he could hide anything from an entity strong enough to defeat, destroy, divert or whatever else it did to so many Tao lords. The fact, then, that he had not already been stopped or punished, and had even been allowed to take so many privileges from the jungle, meant that whoever it was behind this scheme did not mean to harm him or harm him immediately at least. These things could not so easily be predicted. After all, the whims of the powerful were a flimsy thing to depend on. Listen here, dentist. I may be no beacon of justice for the universe, but that does not mean I will ignore every injustice. So long as I live and breathe, I will never stand by and let those I care about come to harm. And should it happen that I am unable to protect them, for whatever reason, my retribution will not go unmet. This, I swear. As far as oaths go, Lex's was nowhere near as deep, as stringent, or as noble as most paladins. In fact, to a degree, his oath was anchored in Lex's selfish nature of only attending to those he cared about, rather than the weak or innocent that normal paladins seek to protect. But Lex's oath was sincere, and he was willing to act on it, even in the face of great obstacles. The fact that he nearly died crossing the previous barrier proved it, and served as a testament to his integrity. That was enough to elicit the faintest of responses from the path of power that the paladins followed. The fact that his oath was witnessed by beings of unimaginable power, granted it a whole lot more power than Lex could have ever expected, or anticipated. Chapter 1627, Acknowledged. At first, it was just a game. Mr. Big Fat Guy found a Kuan Pung, an endangered yet powerful race, and wanted to pass on its heritage lest it be lost in time forever. Such a thing was not the purpose of the jungle, but that did not mean it could not be used like that either. Everything that happened afterwards, too, was of little consequence. Let alone a small army of Earth immortals, even if a billion such armies appeared, it would not pose any threat to the purpose or foundation of the jungle. Watching the human, toying with him, teasing him, all of those things were done in the spirit of entertainment. They could easily inform him that his friends were safe, but where would be the fun in that? Playing with the human was almost as entertaining as watching Mr. Big Fat Guy get irritated every time they brought him closer to entering the innermost layer of the jungle. But then something unexpected happened. The human did something they had never seen before, and suddenly the jovial atmosphere within the jungle turned into a somber silence. Those who were awake all turned their attention to him, and those who were asleep all woke up. Those who cared not for him at all suddenly learned to care, and those who were toying with him suddenly took him very seriously. It was not that the power he gained was phenomenal, nor was it unprecedented in magnitude. No, the thing that attracted their attention was that the nature of this power was something that they had never seen before. It was entirely and genuinely a wholly new cultivation path. Lex, unaware that he had gained so much attention, focused entirely on understanding what was happening to him, and where the power was coming from. Lex, a man with great exposure and excellent comprehension as a result of his own cultivation technique, was able to gain an immense amount of insight not only about the process itself, but the origin of the paladin's power, and some of the finer nuances relating to it. He felt recognition, and traced it back to events in his past. His oath, feeble as it was, had a foundation in truth and hardship. He saw the Midnight Battalion, fighting on a stranded planet, fragile space all around them, and uncertainty grabbing at their hearts. He saw how, despite their resilient expressions and courageous acts, hints of fear crept into their hearts. He saw how feeble they felt in the face of circumstances, and saw how the only hope they had were the words of the Innkeeper that help was on the way. Lex could fool his workers, and he could fool the universe at large, but he could never fool himself. He was the Innkeeper. The Innkeeper's words were his words, and his actions were the Innkeeper's actions. He crossed space, threatened the Henali with bombs, flew through endless space, unraveled a conspiracy and fought against a weakened deity, putting himself in risk every step of the way, just to save those he cared about. His actions and intentions had been recognized, and they had been acknowledged. Lex saw another vision, one of an ancient history he had only heard about. He saw David Paladin, the founding father of the Paladin Order. Despite the story, the praise, the legacy he had built, the vision of the past revealed the truth. He was no warrior with an iron will. He was a clerk, weak and feeble-bodied. When the demon horde came for his settlement, he did not stand defiant, sword and shield in hand. He had not ripped a door off its hinges and grabbed a pillar, defying the odds through sheer will. No, he cried and prayed and hoped for a higher power to save him. Yet through eyes, blurry with tears, and with arms that had only ever known the weight of books, he stood alone, afraid but unyielding. He had not a door torn off its hinges, but a drawer pulled out of his desk. He had not a pillar that supported a building, but the leg broken off his chair. David Paladin had not made his first stand with an iron heart and an unbreakable will. He had done so filled with desperation. For his wife, for his child, he had faced death, swearing with every breath to not let them come to harm. It was not the onset of battle that granted him powers, like his legends told. It was his demonstration of his oath, in the face of impossible adversity, and his subsequent success that granted him the powers that the Paladin were so proud of. In that moment, Lex gained a deeper understanding of the Paladin's path than most actual Paladins themselves. Only the High Justiciars and above understood the truth as he understood it. But, perhaps, even they might not know the significance of it like Lex did. The power of the Paladins came from demonstration and recognition. The Paladins had a holy aura because the entity that witnessed and granted them recognition was the heaven, not like Eden or the others, but the heaven that made up the entire space of the universe. It wasn't as if heaven was a sentient entity or something like that, at least as far as Lex understood. It was more like, everything that happened in the universe was being witnessed by it, and it had a significant amount of power, so much so that its mere acknowledgement of a Paladin's actions and oaths triggered their power. The holy aura was also as a result of that recognition stemming from heaven. But the thing that Lex did not understand was that despite the type of power being influenced by heaven, the power itself did not originate from heaven. Instead, it was still a part of the same power paradigm that deities were a part of, as a result of the Paladin's own faith in their oath. But how could something as fragile as faith transform into actual power? That was like literally saying that a cultivator was becoming stronger using the power of friendship. Since both were abstract concepts, with no physical existence to speak of, they were technically interchangeable, right? But why did that work? Lex felt like the moment he understood that, he would unravel the secrets of the Paladin's powers. Oh, there was also one more mystery for him to solve, because, of course, his experience was abnormal compared to other Paladins. Why did he feel like he was being observed and acknowledged by more than just heaven? Chapter 1628, Excitement. Lex finally realized why the feeling of power when he was about to take his oath felt so familiar. It was similar to the voice that invited him for a new job that he rejected. A worker for the inn can't be working jobs for other people. He felt it again now, acknowledging his oath, selfish though it may be, for he had truly overcome great adversity to stick to it. An oath that was easy to fulfill was not really impressive. It was only overcoming the impossible, or at the very least overcoming what was very hard, that would prompt the birth of a Paladin's power. For example, fighting off demons with a weak and frail mortal body. That's what David Paladin had to do to attain his powers. Lord only knew what he did after getting his powers. Regardless, Lex felt its presence and finally recognized it. He recognized the second presence too. After all, it wasn't difficult to recognize the insatiable hunger of Abaddon. But, what the hell was up with the countless, weaker presences also acknowledging him? Heaven had the strongest presence, followed by Abaddon. The others were much weaker than the two, but they were still strong enough that acting as a witness still influenced his power. Although he did not understand what they were, their influence was undeniable. Combined with the influence of heaven and Abaddon, the power that Lex developed as a result of becoming a Paladin seemed to have nothing to do with holy power. The entire process happened within seconds, and while the dentist had paused to observe what was happening, Lex did not think it would wait forever. He needed to figure out what his new ability was and if it would be helpful. If not, he needed to resolve his situation. But while Lex thought of a way to get out of his predicament, the innermost layer of the jungle was filled with deafening silence. The beings within had far more perspective than Lex, and gained a whole lot more understanding about the new path they had seen than anyone else. That was exactly why they were all so stunned. "It is unbelievable," said Mr. Big Fat Guy. "How can such a power exist? How can such a path be created now? So many heritages were lost, but it seems the universe was not stagnant even without them." "This path has potential," said another. "The future is not without hope." "This path is incomplete," said Mrs. Big Fat Guy. "Can you think of a solution?" "No need," Mr. Big Fat Guy said. "Perfection is a flaw, and perfectionism is the ultimate sin. Only by remaining incomplete can it benefit when the universe enters its next stage." The Kuanpung looked towards Lex for a while, then snorted. "I tire of this. Bring him in, return the kids to him, and send them from the jungle. You said you'd offer the human some knowledge. Fine, then one of you go ahead and answer one of his questions." Before he could be teased anymore, Mr. Big Fat Guy disappeared, returning to the very bones where Little Blue was. With his departure, the others also returned to their original tasks, no longer paying attention to Lex. Only Mrs. Big Fat Guy remained to send Lex and the others on their way. Lex, ignoring the unusually bead forming on the Go board, ignoring his probe into his newly gained power, looked towards the dentist who suddenly made a move. He took his drill and swiped in the air, yet oddly he did not strike Lex's barrier. Instead, he seemed to cut a hole in space, creating an opening that looked oddly similar to the one that Fenrir and Little Blue had gone through. For a moment Lex thought that he was splitting space, but his most recent experience with sensing presences allowed him to realize that what the dentist had done was something else. He was existing in a certain reality where the presence of Abaddon was omnipresent, yet what the dentist had done was cut that presence, leading to a reality that existed without it, hidden underneath. It was the final layer of protection. Understanding suddenly filled Lex, yet before he could ask the dentist why it had revealed the path, he disappeared, as if he had never been anything more than a mirage. It seemed that whoever had sent the dentist seemed satisfied with Lex's performance. But instead of following the dentist, Lex took a moment to understand his newfound power. It was vastly different from Holy Aura, and seemed to carry the weight of forgotten epics. It was as if it was a power that the universe itself had forgotten about, now renewed. It had no name, Lex instinctively felt so. It was as if, when this power was once extinguished, its name had also been erased from history. Now that it was born again, in him, it needed a new name. Lex, master of naming things regardless of what his system claimed, had no problem with naming it. He needed to understand what it did first, though. Lex summoned this new force, and he felt it tap into his spiritual power, but also his will power, as it manifested in front of. Green light, condensed into tiny pentagons, shimmered in the air in front of him and enriched the air. Before Lex fully comprehended what the ability was, the lotus tattoo on his back suddenly manifested, and Lotus spoke with a voice more enthused than Lex had ever heard. "This is incredible. This is absolutely incredible. What is it?" "I don't know. I actually don't know, but I must have it. Lex, please, return to the realm. Fuse this power with the land. I feel this will unlock a whole new realm of possibilities." Lex could feel Lotus' excitement seeping into his body, as if it had discovered its long-lost mother or something. "Can you sense what this does? Can you tell me its effects?" Lex asked, watching the green light as it began to spiral around him. "I have no idea, but I can feel it with my new instincts. Although I'm still far from fusing with the whole Midnight Realm, I have gained some understanding of it. This thing, whatever it is very good for realms." Chapter 1629, Kindness. "Good for realms, huh?" Lex said with curiosity. He had a crazy idea. Honestly, he should stop using such adjectives now. All his ideas were crazy. Crazy was his norm now. So in that case, Lex had a very normal idea. Since he was bonded with Lotus, who was fused with a realm, it was almost as if Lex was fused with a realm. he frequently got feedback from his relationship with Lotus. Heck, he even had a transformation of his own that depended on Lotus, not that he wanted to tell Z about it. The poor kid was working so hard on getting more forms. Anyway, Lotus wanted Lex to return to the inn to fuse that power into the realm, but that wouldn't happen anytime soon. So, he pursed his lips and sucked the shimmering green pentagons right out of the air, absorbing them. But the power originated from Lex to begin with. Absorbing it would have no effect. Instead of absorbing it himself, he directed it towards his back, where his tattoo had appeared, and channeled it into Lotus. "What did you just do?" Lotus asked. "I changed my mind. Don't come back to the realm. Just keep doing whatever you just did." Lex smirked, and dismissed his ability for now. While he could not understand the actual effects of the ability, he understood his body quite well. When the tattoo absorbed some of those green pentagons, it appeared as though nothing really happened, but Lex sensed that at the very base of his black tattoo, a single pigment of color began to appear. The otherwise black tattoo showed signs of a deeper evolution. Lex kept the change in mind, and decided that he would investigate it further later on. He did not believe that the power would only have a single function or be one-dimensional. After all, paladins could fight, they could heal, they could protect and do so much, all using the same type of power. For now, though, it was time to move forward. Mentally, he placed all his newly accumulated beads on the go board. He had noticed that, recently, his opponent had stopped adding pieces to the board. He didn't know what that guy was planning, but Lex would not wait for him to act first. The more pieces he placed, the greater his understanding of the board. With nothing else left to do, he grabbed Naraka and focused. Since he had already distinctly felt the presence of Abaddon when he was making his oath, it was very easy for him to pick it out once again. For a moment, he wondered what it meant that Abaddon had witnessed or acknowledged his oath. It did not feel like Abaddon had made any conscious decision, nor did he feel any less hostility or hunger from it. It was as if its presence alone was sufficient for the oath's completion, and its actual sentiments, if a realm could have sentiments, did not matter. That was so odd. Yet another thing for him to ponder on. Lex focused his sword intent, and specifically targeted Abaddon's presence, cutting neither space nor even the air. Instead, his sword cut into the already frail presence that Abaddon maintained this deep in the jungle. His sword cut through the presence with ease, and revealed behind the cut a passage for him to enter. The process was too easy, far easier than any obstacle Lex had overcome to get this far. He did not think the ease was because of his own skill. Lex didn't doubt he was awesome, but it was also clear that from the moment he took his paladin's oath, something had changed. From being rejected into this place, he suddenly went to being welcomed. Lex fixed his tie, making sure he looked presentable, and walked into the opening. The passage looked very plain and bare, as if it was a hall in a government building, and at the far end there was a door, though a single glance at the door gave Lex the feeling that he wasn't supposed to go there. It was as if his instincts told him to remember that door, but not go towards it. Instead of walking towards it, Lex turned around. Rather than the opening he had come from, he saw endless rolling hills, covered in thin mist, flowing as if coming and going from eternity. He recognized the mist that he had been absorbing, yet over here it somehow seemed a lot more substantial. It also flowed away from him, never touching him, but going around him instead. But he did not feel like he was losing out. Instead, he felt like the mist was protecting him as if it was too much for him to even touch. But that was far from all. He even felt like the mist was being exceptionally kind to him, covering the land to hide things that he should not see. There was no other way to describe it. It felt like kindness, as if this place, whatever it was, sincerely appreciated his existence. Many things in Lex's mind clicked, and Lex fell into a trance, watching the mist gently passing over the landscape. With his left eye, he could see deep into the world, peering at the laws. Through it, he could also see karma. While the details of the karma of this land eluded him, he could feel that the kindness of this place was as a reaction to his good karma. As he began to understand the consequences of good or positive karma, he went deeper into a trance. He'd never wondered before, because it seemed so obvious, but why was certain karma good or bad? Who created those definitions? Was it the karma itself that determined what was good or bad? As it turned out, at least according to the understanding Lex was developing at that moment, good or bad karma was determined by whether the consequence of something was good or bad for the universe, on both a micro and macro scale. Lex began getting insight into the universal equivalent of the trolley problem. It was infinitely more complex, with an endless number of variables. Instead of judging the problem based on morality or law or philosophy, it looked at it from the immediate and long-term consequences and repercussions of each action, reaction, and even existence of each situation, as it pertained to the existence of the universe. Lex fell into a state of enlightenment, gaining a deeper and more esoteric understanding of karma, its consequences and origins. Chapter 1630, One Question. His enlightenment did not last long, relatively speaking, and in just a few days Lex woke up from his trance. The more he learned about karma, the more he appreciated just how deep and unpredictable a field this was. Even if the definition of good and bad karma could be narrowed down to what was good and bad for the universe, Lex did not think that's all there was to it. After all, if the focus of karma was simply to promote the growth of the universe, why could it be used to do great harm? Why had his imbalance of karma threatened him? Why were Tao Lords still unsure of its depths? He was fortunate that there were still many things he did not understand about karma, meaning that there were directions for him to research on. But if there were ever a day he no longer had questions, he would have to remind himself to stay humble, and look deeper into this field. The next thing he did was look in on the inn. The award ceremony of the Midnight Games was still going on, because many armies were still cultivating themselves. It seemed that they had gained a lot more from the mist than Lex had. Then again, it was only after exposure to that mist, and upon seeing it again, that he too gained enlightenment on karma. Maybe the purpose of the mist was to help with enlightenment. What had happened was that a majority of the guests had left. Since the rewards wouldn't be publicly announced, there was no point in waiting for them to happen anyway. They had stuck around long enough to see that the inn was beginning a new phase of services that were entirely focused on mortals. Many of the inn's unique resources were diluted and used to create opportunities and services that could literally change the lives of most mortals. What Lex appreciated, though, was that these services wouldn't constantly be available. The more resource-intensive services would only be available during short periods at intervals of 6 months, a year, 5 years, or a decade depending on what it was. He would have to look into it in finer detail. Once he saw that there was no emergency waiting for him to handle, he finally turned his attention back to his situation. He was still standing halfway up a hill, surrounded by mist, unable to see anything except for the mist. He could not sense any aura, nor could he feel Femur's location, or find any traces of the 3 missing people. He honestly couldn't even be sure that they had come to this location to begin with. But Lex wasn't about to turn back without at least searching the area. With that said, as soon as he raised his leg to step forward, his body froze. He was not pressed down with a powerful aura. He did not feel anything restricting him either. Lex just froze. A figure rose out of the mist in front of Lex, her appearance a blur to Lex's mind, and looked at him for a moment. "You have quite the karma for someone so young and weak," a female voice spoke to Lex in his mind, commenting on him as if she could read his entire life with a glance. "It is quite an achievement, I will admit. If you continue at the rate you're going, you will either die a spectacular death, die a horrible death, or end up as quite the big name in the universe. You can guess for yourself which ones are the most likely." Lex could not respond. He could only listen. The thing was, it wasn't that he was incapable of doing anything. He might have tried various means to free himself if he were under some kind of restriction. The problem itself was in the fact that there was no restriction on him. Instead, it was as if he had entirely lost the ability to even conceive the notion of doing anything other than existing in the state in which he already was. It was as if his spirit had been crippled, without hampering his ability to comprehend new information. "I have been tasked with handling you, which, fortunately for you, does not include ending your existence. So I will now give you some information, and you will act on it, and that will be that. The one you call Little Blue has been summoned here, not for any harmful reason, but only so that he may inherit the heritage of his race. Those who accompanied him have also been rewarded appropriately, if only for accompanying him. Out of appreciation for your genuine loyalty, as well as your demonstration of the progress of the universe's cultivation path, your earlier display of disrespect has been forgiven, and you have been awarded the opportunity to ask a single question, which will be answered within your capacity to hear. Choose your question wisely, for you will only get one question. Once you have your answer, you will be teleported back to your tavern, where you must wait until Little Blue has received the complete heritage. Only after Little Blue returns will you be allowed to leave. Oh, and you also won't be allowed back in the inner jungle again. With her short speech given, the blurry figure returned Lex's mental faculties to him, allowing him to put down his foot and think carefully about what he wanted to ask. There were too many questions he was curious about, ranging from secrets of the jungle, to Abaddon, to questions about Little Blue and how long the heritage transfer would take. But he did not carelessly speak or choose his question. This was a critical moment, and he had to get the most out of it. He went over everything the being had told him, everything he had experienced on his journey here, and everything he knew about the jungle to carefully construct a list of topics and things that the figure might know about, and what he would benefit most from knowing. The issue was, he didn't even know the topics the figure could answer questions on. He had to take a guess about what this figure might or might not know, and then decide the most beneficial or crucial question for him in this situation.